Thank you for joining us today for a Gallows Hill Heritage Week presentation. My name is Christina O'Connor and I have been managing the Gallows Hill Project since 2015 with Eddie Cantwell. We are really excited today to bring you a bit of a presentation by Dave Pollock, an archaeologist who has been working with us since 2015, and Dr Linda Lynch, who joined us last year when we made the startling discovery of human burials on the summit of the hill. So really looking forward to hearing a little bit about the findings of the excavation. Just to give those a bit of a background who don't know the hill or may have not visited the site, Gallows Hill is a very large mound and it sits right on the edge of Dungarvan town. It's around a kilometre from the stone castle on the quay. And despite its very large size, it's fairly well hidden today behind modern housing. And with well over 5 years of research behind us, we can fairly confidently say that the name Gallows Hill dates from its later use as a gallows in the 16th, 17th centuries. In 2015, when we began, we knew absolutely nothing about the history of Gallows Hill. And last year and this year has been quite exceptional, and it's really transformed, I suppose, what was speculated for a long, long time to be an Anglo-Norman site and the beginning, I suppose, of Dungarvan into a much earlier site. And this is really exciting for us because it's great that a community project has I suppose, found evidence that Dungarvan, which is known as an Anglo-Norman settlement, founded during this period, is actually much earlier. And there was a site here much, much earlier, hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. So it's really, really exciting. The site is really intriguing, and I think that's what drew us in 2015 to first investigate the site. Growing up in Dungarvan, you would be aware of Gallows Hill and tales of banshees as a child, but there is a lot more. Over the last few years, we've been recording folklore and looking at the landscape, and as well as banshees and giants and swords, there are numerous tales of tunnels around the site. And this was always a bit intriguing, especially as it was thought to be Anglo-Norman, and you wouldn't normally associate tunnels or souterrains with this period. So to have this early date really makes this a little bit more exciting and hopefully something we can look at in the future. And early historians like Canon Power did believe it was an earlier site. He believed the townland of Lochmore was actually a misinterpretation of Lochmore and related to Gallows Hill, which was once part of the townland. And of course, we have a standing stone 100 metres northwest, still standing in a local garden. We have a pit we excavated for another standing stone just 70 metres west of the hill in Spring or Tugger and Wheel, well of the sacred tree. So lots of interesting place names, landscape folklore, and certainly a lot more to look into. We began the project in 2015, and since then we've completed 2 seasons, 2 years of geophysics with geophysicist Kevin Barton, and 3 years of excavations with Dave Pollock and Joe Moran. So I am really excited now to hand you over to Dave, who's going to talk a little bit about what we found last year in 2019. So over to Dave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christy. Well, I am Dave Pollock, an archaeologist, and I came on board with the Adopt a Monument group 3 years ago to have a look at Gallows Hill. I wanted to have a look at the inside of it. Gallows Hill really appeared to be a motte, one of these earth and timber castles of the 12th, 13th century, that sort of a time. And these castles were built in a very special way, or at least some of them were built in a very special way. They're very steep-sided, they're a bit like Christmas puddings, and they had a bit of a ditch round the outside, which is generally filled in by now, a ditch which they took the material out of to build a mound. Well, they didn't just dig it out and stick it in the middle, they had a technique, or at least so I was led to believe. And the technique was to dig a ditch in a ring, bit like a big polo or a donut, and throw the material on the inside, so you end up with a sort of sticky up donut with a cut into the ground donut outside it. Well, that's about half the job, because once you've got to that stage, you then have to do the rest, which is filling in the inside. And to do that, they don't just dig the ditch deeper, they dig it in towards the centre. So they end up cutting away half of the ring that they've only just built and throwing that into the inside. Now, it seems like a lot of extra effort, but the advantage of doing it this way is if you cut a slice through the finished mound, you can see in the tip lines of all the soil and stones and things that go into it, you can see this inside half of a donut there in the tip lines. Now, all the tip lines, instead of tipping out of the mound, they're actually tipping into it, which means as the mound settles, it doesn't slide away to the edge, it slides into the middle and gets more compact, and it means that you can have a mound with very, very steep sides. And that's how they're drawn on the Bayer tapestry, where we have mottes, pictures of mottes from the time. They're drawn with very, very steep sides. Anyway, I wanted to have a look at it. So when I was asked to join in, I immediately said yes, and we decided that the first thing we would do is cut a trench in at about ground level. That way we would find the ditch running around the mound, we could cut into the side of the mound, get an idea of how they built it, just see if they did build it this particular way, and pick up something on the ground underneath it. A little bit of charcoal would do nicely, then we could send that off for a radiocarbon date. And then with any luck, we'd get a date on when they built the castle, which should be, as I said, in the 1100s or 1200s, that sort of a time. Well, it didn't quite work out as planned. We didn't manage to get in to see the fabric of the mound because although we got in some distance, we were still in the material that had been slipping off it in the last 1,000 years or so. So we didn't really get into it, and needless to say, we didn't get underneath it to look for a bit of charcoal. We did find the ditch, and we found another two. So there were 3 ditches, one that seemed part of building the mound, and 2 spares. And the 2 spares I put down as likely reuses of the mound, turning it into an artillery fort in the 16th, 17th century, that sort of a thing. So in 2018, we went back not to look at the bottom of the mound, but to look at the top of it, which we knew had been used for bonfires for a number of years, so we were not expecting it to be in very good condition. However, it was in excellent condition. There was no real damage from the fires at all, strangely. And within a very short while of cutting down a trench on the top, we started to pick up human remains, little bits and pieces, the odd tooth, but more than teeth, really. We were getting little bits of skull and one little piece of skull and jaw which seemed to be associated, and suddenly we realized we were dealing with skeletons of people. And then where we put a test pit in to get well down into the mound, we found a pretty intact burial, so we knew we had burials up there. Well, we were only there for a week, so we decided to come back, get through the burials and check out what else was up on the mound. Now, obviously, with burials up there, there was something going on, and it did rather look as though there had been executions up there. So, after all, Gallows Hill looks as though it might have been a hill with a gallows on it, which wasn't really what I was expecting at all. I thought that was just a story. There was a famous locally historian, a county historian in the 18th century, just round the corner, and he never mentioned any executions on the thing. Anyway, we went back and we were funded by the Royal Irish Academy. They jumped in and gave us the funding to actually dig for 2 weeks instead of 1. So we dug for 2 weeks instead of one, which gave us enough time to dig our way through the burials. We didn't dig all the burials way on top. There are probably quite a lot of them. Some of them were very shallow, some of them were a fair bit deeper. Now the shallow ones were really too shallow. They were the ones that were less than 10 centimetres down from the top, and they were an awful mess. They'd been kicked around, disturbed. Bits of skeleton disturbed, a bit disturbed anyway. And then we had these other ones, and we only saw a few of them because we generally didn't go that deep, at about 1/2 metre in. Now that's the right kind of depth for a burial, not for a modern one. They tend to be deeper, but for an old one. So those seemed all right, and then there were these other ones that were much too shallow. After a while, it occurred to me that the shallow ones had actually been proper ones, but someone had cut away the soil on top. They'd just taken it away. So it looks as though we'd had a bunch of burials on top of the mound, something to do with executions, no doubt, because it's a very strange place for a cemetery. You don't want to sort of carry dead people up a very steep hill. It could end up in tragedy. So I suspect they were walking up there hale and hearty, or at least hale, and executed on top and buried more or less where they fell, because they were arranged in a fairly haphazard order up on top there. Well, some of them were buried when the ground level was fairly high, then the ground level was cut down, and the rest were buried there. And as they cut the ground level down, as soon as they started finding bones, they stopped cutting it down any further. So that was it. We had 2 lots of burials on top. We got radiocarbon dates from them, and they're from the sort of either the 1500s or the 1600s. It's that sort of a time. Kind of time when there was a bit of trouble around Ireland, a bit of trouble everywhere actually, all over Europe. But in Ireland there was a fair bit of piracy going on, things like that. It was a tricky time. So these were probably public executions that had been taking place on top. We had another trench, which we put in last year. This is 2019, and that was off the top of the hill, down on the other side. Now we'd found 3 ditches. We'd found 3 ditches on one side when we looked. One that seemed to be the ditch that the mound was cut from, if you like, the first one that went round it, and then 2 spares that I thought was something to do with reusing the place as an artillery fort. When we went down the other side, we found 2 ditches. One of them, a nice big chunky one, seemed to have some fairly late material in it, so it was open really quite late, back into the sort of 18th century, something like that. But there was another one, a bit tighter in to the side of the mound. Well, actually very tight in, underneath it, actually, underneath the edge of it. So we had a ditch just underneath the edge of the mound, which was a little odd. And we managed to get some charcoal from that ditch, managed to send it off to Belfast for a date, and our dates came back in the early 5th or early 6th, early 5th to the early 6th century, somewhere in that range of about 100 years, which is much too early for our motte. So something is going on under our motte. And whatever was going on under our motte was still there as a bit of a bump in the landscape when someone stuck a motte on top of it, we suspect. Now, exactly which ditches on the other side belong with the ones we found last year in 2019, we're not too sure. So we do want to go back and put in another couple of trenches if we can raise the readies, and just check out and see which ditches go with which and what exactly was going on there before the Anglo-Normans decided to put up a castle in the 12th, 13th century. Anyway, with that, I will hand you over to Linda Lynch, who will talk about the bodies we found on the hill. So it's all yours, Linda.
Hi, my name is Dr. Linda Lynch, and I'm an osteoarchaeologist, so an archaeologist trained in the analysis of human skeletal remains. And I'm just going to briefly speak today about the human remains that were uncovered in 2019 in Gallows Hill. I was lucky enough to be called to attend on site from human remains became apparent. Human remains had been uncovered there in 2018 as well. So when I got to site and throughout the day of examination of the remains, we uncovered that there were at least 5 burials, probably, sorry, at least 4 burials and probably a 5th burial there as well. And this adds to a tally of, I believe, 4 other burials in 2018. And what I suppose I need to stress from the outset is that these burials, although confirmed that there were human burials on the summit of the mound, they weren't fully excavated and they weren't removed from the site. As archaeologists, we are very much guided by ethics and morals when it comes to human remains, and we prefer to actually not excavate them if it's not necessary or if it's not part of a strong research agenda. And that was the focus of the excavations that are ongoing at Gallows Hill at the moment. That, you know, we want to limit to a certain degree the intrusion on the site. So we wanted to confirm firstly that, you know, burials were on the site, human remains were on the site, and the nature of those burials. But the key here was to establish the date of the burials. As I said, you know, there was previous evidence that the burials were on the site, but radiocarbon dating of those in 2018 actually failed, unfortunately, because another problem with the human remains is that the preservation on the site is appalling in terms of human remains. And this has impacts there in terms of being able to obtain radiocarbon. We were successful with 2 burials from 2019. So the only skeletal remains we took was literally about 10 grams of bone from 2 burials to obtain radiocarbon dates. And these came back at giving dates between the late 15th century and the mid 17th century. In terms of osteoarchaeology, we look at 2 aspects, and it's looking at the skeletal remains and what they can tell us about the individuals that are buried. And then it's about the context of the burial and what that is telling us about, I suppose, the community that essentially buried them. In the case of the first, in terms of the osteological information, we're limited here because we didn't remove the burials, so they weren't studied in a laboratory situation, so we're limited in terms of being able to determine the age of death, the sex, what diseases they may have had. The honest information like that would be limited in this instance anyway because of the very poor preservation on the site. As I said, we were able to confirm that the vast majority of the burials certainly is purely adult, although there's some indications of possibly adolescent individuals and one individual and possibly a younger individual, but that's certainly not definite. We weren't able to determine really the sex of any individual with any great certainty. So that's unfortunate, but it is, I suppose the other aspect is the key here, the context of these burials. There was always the suggestion that they related to individual military engagements that would have occurred in the area, particularly maybe in the 17th century. But the dates suggest that they are broader in terms of the period of burial, but it is the actual nature of the burials themselves that suggests that they are occurring over a period of time. They're not related to a single event, be it a battle, be it a disease epidemic or whatever. So they're individual burials occurring over a period of time, and this is primarily based on the fact that there's a huge variation in the orientation of burials. A typical Christian burial would be considered to be an individual buried on their back, with their head to the west. Okay, but in this case, we have one individual buried with the head to the east. We have at least 2 individuals buried with the head to the north. So these are essentially non-conforming burials, and that can occur in certain what we call dissenting burials, such as those of Quakers who don't conform to traditional Catholic, I suppose, in particular, premise of burial, or Christian premise of burial. But in this instance, you're talking about the context of somewhat of a motte, of a mound. It's not your typical burial place for your general Christian cemetery in this post-medieval period. It doesn't conform to any semblance of that. The prominence of it, location of it away from the actual town of Dungarvan, the medieval town of Dungarvan itself, and obviously the name Gallows Hill would suggest that it is, at least at some stage, it was the site of executions. And this is somewhat suggested by the burials as well. Although we have absolutely no skeletal evidence of executions. And in this instance, in this period, you're talking in particular about execution for the general person by hanging, by the short drop, which is essentially strangulation. Beheading would have been for high treason in particular. But we have no skeletal evidence that this is primarily due to the fact that the burials haven't been excavated from the site, and such evidence, there may be no skeletal evidence anyway of that type of execution. But it is the nature of the burials themselves and where they are that are suggested that this may indeed be a gallows site. Up until the 18th century, if you were executed, your body was generally buried where you died, or where your body was displayed in perhaps a gibbet. After the 18th century, after the end of the 18th century, executed individuals tended to be claimed back by the family and buried, elsewhere rather than at the execution site. And the prominence of the site is key as well. It's a perfect site for to be an execution site. It gives a visual display of authority to literally have, and it's graphic no matter what way you say it, but there's bodies potentially of individuals being executed there, hanging there for a period of time, and then knowing that those individuals are also being buried on that hillside. The punishment for whatever they did goes on and is burned into the memory of those who see these executions, who see these burials on this prominent mound. There's a huge potential of work to emerge from this site, but even as it is, the information that we're getting is phenomenal. Even without the excavation of these very, very poorly preserved burials, we're still able to extract a huge amount of information. And the post-excavation analysis is ongoing. It's drawing together all the various strands of analysis, and I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to be part of it. And hopefully we will be able to bring you more in the future.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much to Dave and Linda for taking the time today to do that and to give us a really, really good insight into what it is that we found last year at Gallows Hill. So it's really, really quite exciting, I think, when you hear the details. And thank you also to the Royal Irish Academy for funding our community project last year and the excavation. And also, of course, to Waterford County Council and Adopt a Monument Ireland, who have been a fantastic support to us since we began in 2015. So it seems the name Gallows Hill, there is certainly a lot more to the site and a lot more to its name. And it's been really exciting over the last 5 years to try and unravel a little bit of the history and to find out exactly what is going on the site. So thank you so much to John Foley, who's helped us put the presentation together, and also to our fantastic volunteers. And without their passion, dedication, the project really would not have progressed and really would not have continued all of these years. So thank you to everybody for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to bringing you more exciting developments about the Gallows Hill Project over the coming year. Thank you very much.